theme of this conference in general is building resilient enterprises, creating wealth and jobs. Day 3 of this conference, and it gives me great pleasure now to introduce Rosa Ndwati Mutero. She will be speaking on this theme for today, regulatory frameworks for the changing business environment.
Good morning, everyone, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here today, sort of to start us off discussion that we need to have today, more particularly the panel discussion that we will, and of course the questions that will come in from everyone who's listening in, so that we can have a dialogue about the regulatory framework and the changing business environment. I don't know whether we can put up some slides which we could go through. So what I'd like to do in terms of setting the stage for this discussion this morning is sort of to frame our minds around what's become the new normal, around our regulatory framework, around legislative changes, and just how business laws are affecting how we do our work. So we'll talk about the recent and expected regulatory changes. I'll talk a bit about health and safety because I think it's really important that we touch on that. What's been the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on labor relations and employment contracts in particular? Because I was asked to speak specifically about that, given that we are speaking to employers. And then a bit about emerging jurisprudence in employment and labor relations matters, but also sort of to challenge ourselves, what next? So what else do we need to do? So I put there on that slide just some new language that was a new normal. So funny that this time last year, none of these were words that we knew about. Maybe we knew them, but they were at the real back of our heads, of our minds. I mean, so definitely social distancing was something really new. And now even when you go to the villages, you find small children chanting social distancing, face masks, sanitize, in the many ways in which sanitize has been bastardized since it came out as a word that we use regularly. I don't think a day passes without someone saying Zoom or Teams, and I know we all feel wired out with the number of Zoom. Once we had our first case on 12th of March, then employers were wondering, what do we do with our staff? We've been asked to send them home. We don't have sufficient systems and structures in place. And then a new word that we need to use more and more, particularly here in Kenya, gaining a lot of precedent around the world. But what is a gig economy? And with people sitting at home, should they really just be working for one employer? Should they really just be doing one thing? Is there enough for one employer to give one employee, or should we really be exploring a freer employment market, for example? I also wanted us to think about what our old normal actually was. And on my next slide, I've put some words that this we have had ever since. I mean, we always talk about corruption, we talk about inefficient systems. One of the things that was a real joy for me was during COVID, traffic had gone down. It's back right now. You know, it's a Friday again when you find traffic. Old paper systems, K clause and systems, and we complained about this, and this was our old normal. And what I would like us to think about to set stage for the regulatory framework is, how is the new normal changing our old normal? And what is it that we are accepting to live with as old normal that we really can kick out through regulatory frameworks that change our business systems? So maybe coming closer home on the new normal in terms of our employment environment on my next slide. So how have things changed literally? So we've had a lot of things change, increased working from home. It's become common in the middle of a Zoom call for a 5-year-old to sneak into the call and wave because people are just working generally from home. Salary reductions, which were very hard to introduce or implement under our employment law systems, became the normal term. what I call fallow measures. I know sometimes fallow is not a word we use in our economy, but a lot of the things we did in terms of sending people home, giving them unpaid leave, actually do fit into fallow measures. And some of the measures that businesses took, and I know a lot of you will relate with this, is we just told people not to come. Don't come because there's COVID, and there wasn't any formal structures around it. We were under a flurry of activity at the law firm because employers were calling us left, right, and center. What are we supposed to put in place? There's nothing that gives guidance. We want to give unpaid leave, and we were telling them there's no concept like unpaid leave under Kenyan law. So what do we do? So there were salary reductions, there were redundancies, there was of course reduced working hours, and all of us as employers had to grapple with how do we fit what we need to do into what the law actually says. Now, I know there can be huge debate as to whether we changed things fast enough. Did we act fast enough? Did the laws change to suit the new business environment? Or, like has been the tale, was the law lagging behind? But I think, in my own view, you could answer that question yes and no. There were some changes that came in swift, and are commendable, and it's good to give commendation where it is due. And then there are some things that we still haven't done. 6 months later, 9 months now, going towards the end of the year, since our first COVID case, and we are stuck in our old ways, or our laws just are not speaking into the new business environment. And I hope that we could have a discourse around some of those things. So you will remember some of these regulatory changes that came in. There was a huge headline when the president announced the relief that was being offered for Kenyans. There was reduction of VAT, there was reduction of PAYE, and those seemingly gave relief. There was regulatory changes that came in through regulators such as the Central Bank of Kenya. I know a lot of us have enjoyed transferring money without paying a transfer fee. All those came in as part of regulatory changes pushed by regulators, sort of to give relief to the Kenyan economy and the Kenyan individuals. There was also the issue of embracing electronic court cases. Now, sometimes COVID, of course, we say is a bad thing, but there's always a silver lining, because we've tried to go electronic in our court system for years, and there's just never been any joy on it. And then suddenly one day courts were closed, and quickly something had to be put together. I know it had a lot of hitches. I know there are lawyers who could be listening to me and right now trying to upload their document for the 20th time, and it's just not working, but at least we are somewhere. And so those are things that, in my view, some of the things that happened quite quickly that probably are good for the economy and good for doing business. So drilling down just a bit into what were actually the laws. So there were Business Laws Amendments Act that came in that changed the way we do business. It touched on quite a number of the laws that are existing. There were tax laws amendments, and this is what brought in the change in VAT, the change in PAYE. I know for a lot of businesses, we felt like government gave with one hand and then took with the other, because some of the laws, for example, removing of the exemption on transfer of businesses, VAT on transfer of businesses, is something government took quickly away. And so seemingly there was relief on one end, but pain on the other. There are certain other changes, for example, around retirement benefits. The RBA the regulator was quick to issue regulations to help in terms of giving relief from paying pension and all of that. And those were notable changes that helped ease business. There are also expected regulatory changes that are still in the pipelines. Some of them are still under discussion. Some of them are bills, haven't come into effect. But these are things that we need to be aware about, know how we are going to adjust to. But more importantly, what are we going to do around what hasn't actually been done yet? So based on what we've talked about, on my next slide, my question is, and I guess interesting to hear what the panel will say, were these changes sufficient then? Are they sufficient now? So we've had time to think about it, time to adjust, and do we feel that the regulatory changes are sufficient for the business environment that we find ourselves in? And my real challenge for the day is, can we do more? I also was asked to give a perspective just very briefly on employment law specific in terms of the changes that came in and what employers are required to do, and to give a view on that. I did hear the CS speak on the day that the conference was launched. I believe that was on Wednesday, and he spoke a bit about this. And I think there were some swift actions that were taken, coming up with the memorandum of understanding between employers, employees, facilitated by the ministry, was indeed a good move. On one hand, the second hand is whether drilling down to the basics, are we actually following the spirit and the law of that MOU? Just yesterday, I had a client call in and tell me that the labor, their union is bringing problems. They want them to enter into a new CBA and things like that. And I was like, but we have an MOU, and why aren't we following the law on that? The other thing that was done around employment, on my next slide, is return to work advisories, which I think were quite comprehensive, but had quite a bit of gray areas around them. People suddenly didn't know, are we responsible for testing our employees? If they get sick, is it us who need to take care of their medical bills? And things like that that were left unspoken. I do understand that behind the scenes it's different, it's a difficult conversation to have. But rather than go the route of leaving things without specific legislation, it's the worse evil than to keep quiet than to address the issue head on, even though it has cost implications. Another thing that we felt, from my perspective, that was done, which was quite important, was around health and safety requirements. Again, on my next slide, which I believe helped businesses to understand what it is that they needed to put in place. Of course, there were cost implications around putting these health and safety requirements in place. If all of a sudden your small office space needed to have 1.5 meters between one employee and the other, how do you achieve that? Where do the desks come from? Where do we find the systems and mechanisms that support putting in the health and safety requirements? And then when we put in, when the directives came out, there was a need to put in a health and safety statement. There was a need to report to the directorate, and then there was no mechanism to support it, and no capacity indeed to receive the information. So again, quick moves, but laying the capacity behind it so that to make sure it really actually works, so that we can reduce the rate of infections. So winding down on my discussion so that we can move on to the panel. I did talk about measures that have now become a new normal, so I don't need to talk about them a lot. The one that I'd like to highlight is the provision of insurance as employers. A couple of you will remember that we had a provision that required employers to take insurance for their employees. That provision was since declared unconstitutional. And then under the directives, there's now a requirement to obtain and maintain an insurance policy. And that shift and that change is something I wanted to highlight as a regulatory change that has a cost implication, of course, but also something for employers to think around compliance. So one of the other things I wanted to bring onto the table for discussion, particularly for employers, we found ourselves in places where we have extra workforce. We don't know what to do with them, how to deal with them, and how to follow the law. And so the question that has come quite frequently, I put in two questions that we found was a frequent question all along through the past 9 months. Can employers make employees redundant merely because of a pandemic? And does the concept of force majeure apply in employment relationships? These are pertinent questions because, as you know, it's been 9 months in, and Professor Ogutu did say on the first day to us that this is, we may need to be in a core COVID situation and not think through a post-COVID situation. And his point was, this COVID appears to be here to stay. And so these questions we are continuing to grapple with. Some of us, our cash flows managed us until where we are now, but we are wondering what will happen in January. Things haven't picked up. We still have the same number of employees. What can we really, really do? So there's been emerging jurisprudence around some of these issues, and I wanted to highlight them for you. Because of time, I won't go through them in detail, but you'll find that our court system is starting to grapple with how does redundancies get to happen, what is the legal process. There's been, of course, a lot of use of COVID as an excuse for why people have done 1 or 2, 3 things or lay off staff. The courts are not taking it as a blanket reason, and so please keep that in mind. You really need to think about how has it affected my business. So there's COVID, that's fine, but how is it affecting your business, and how can that translate to what you're using as a reason for undertaking your redundancy, your salary reduction. The court is also not entertaining lack of following the process. So in terms of consultations and the things that you need to do with employees of getting consent, the court is still requiring, despite the environment that we find ourselves in, that those issues are actually followed. I'd like to speak a bit about gaps and recommendations in terms of regulatory changes that we actually need to see. From an employment perspective, there's a whole issue of how am I consulting employees who half are in Kisumu, Kakamega, Mombasa, because they all went home during COVID. What am I supposed to do? How do I facilitate that? And how does the law support this new normal that we have? There's the issue of part-time employees. Our laws almost consider all employees to be full-time employees. And so there's a lot of gray area around what if someone only works 2 days a week? What is their sick leave entitlement? What is their leave entitlement? And what have you? So our whole redundancy structure, our whole employment structure does need to think through through a regulatory framework that supports what has become our new normal. And then zooming out of employment just a bit into our business laws, on my next slide, is things that we really need to grapple with as a society. We know that many businesses are going under. There was a newspaper article just the other day about schools, and schools that just won't open in January, private schools, because they've run out of cash. The business owners can't sustain the businesses anymore. They couldn't pay their rent. And the point is, what does the law do to support such businesses? Our insolvency laws are hard even for me to read, and I've been practicing for 17 years. What is a small entrepreneur supposed to do in that base, just to understand that there is support for them in terms of having an insolvent business that can be turned around into a working business. Refining our e-systems is something that we don't have a choice about, and a regulatory framework and a business laws framework that supports e-systems for our courts. A lot of us are quite frustrated now with the land registry. You can't find a file. We've been trying to digitize since I started practicing law, and getting a framework that really just works is not something that I think we can take for granted. A lot of us didn't know how to order in food and how to order from the supermarket, and e-commerce has become our new normal. What laws actually support that? As a consumer protection that allows that even though the bill is just 1,000, I actually do get the service that I need to get from the people providing it. Things such as going paperless. So I gave an example of stamp duty. Why do we need to have physical documents anymore? And what is the benefit of having a system that tells you to put it onto the system and then take the hard copy to the bank or to the land system? We don't need to do that anymore. And these are gaps in our laws and our regulatory framework that we need to think about. And lastly, this is actually my challenge to all of us. We just need to embrace our new normal. We have no choice about that. My second point is actually something that I like to say a lot. We need to follow the law. You know, in Kenya, because we have laws that don't work, and so automatically you end up breaking them. We use that as an excuse to break all the other laws. We don't tell each other enough. We want a society that works, but we don't want to follow the law. But in embracing a new normal and looking at our regulatory framework, let's follow the ones we have as a starting point. Let's push for legislative and regulatory changes for the laws that don't work, because I understand there are laws that don't work. Just the other day I was having a conversation with a client about massing a property, and we wanted to put up flats, and there's a requirement about how far from the boundary you can build, and everyone breaks that law. I mean, if you go around residential properties, residential areas, no one follows that law, but no one is pushing for it to be changed. So we are breaking it and then moving on with life and complaining. And then corruption comes in, because that's the only way you can get your building plan approvals. The other thing, of course, we need to get rid of. We laugh when we see common wananchi talking about tunataka serikali tusaidie. Well, a lot of us in the business environment also do the same thing. We're waiting for government to move. The CS spoke about in his opening ceremony speech. He talked about people asking him where to get jobs, and people looking at him as a CS for labor and expecting him to change everything. It's not going to happen. And we need to be the ones who rise up to the occasion, embrace our new normal, follow our laws, push for what needs to be changed, and stop waiting for government to do everything.
Brilliant. Round of applause for Rosa Nduati there. Thank you so much. Fundamental questions being raised by Rosa. One, did we act fast enough to adjust to the new normal? And were the changes sufficient then? Are they sufficient now? What can we do to become better from now? But my personal favorite is the gig economy.
Gig economy.
Should we be working for one employer? Archie, what do you think?
I don't think so. Don't hold me to it. But I think these are real issues. These are real issues. I'm at home, working from home. My employer cannot supervise me all the time. Why can't I multitask? So unless new laws prevent that or allow that, it will be what it will be. But as you said, agility, companies that are agile will be the ones that actually, come up quick to the mark.
Yeah, and we're also answering your question by what we're doing right here. Other jobs and also this one now. let's bring in our panelists and start this conversation. Let's bring up Rita Kavash's profile. And like myself, I'll just say my name is Trevor Mbija, journalist in Aishiapo. There are people who are much more accomplished. I want to bring up a profile for you so that you see one of our panelists there. Rita Kavash will be coming through to speak to us just now. Rita Kavash is the chairperson at Kenya Motor Industry Association, member governing council at the Automobile Association of Kenya as well. She's independent non-executive chairperson for British American Tobacco Kenya Limited, independent non-executive director at Bumburi Cement Company Limited, board member at Kenya Vision 2030, Kenya Roads Board and National Transport and Safety Authority, and a member governing council at the Kenya Association of Manufacturers. She previously held the position of managing director at General Motors East Africa Limited. You see, Rosa, your question is also being answered there.
We also have with us physically here at the conference Mr. Michael Macharia. Mr. Michael Macharia is the CEO of the Kenya Association of Hotel Keepers and Caterers. He serves as a board member of the Federation of Kenya Employers, also a board member at KEPSA, a board member at the National Tourism Crisis and Response Team, a board member at the Kenya Tourism Federation, a board member on the National Labour Board, to name a few. I work with Mike in the hospitality and tourism sector. He has over 30 years experience in this sector and is considered a forefront runner on all things to do with tourism. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree from in hospitality management and is currently pursuing his second degree in law. Welcome, Michael.
All right, and last but not least, Miss Lindiwe Sepumolo. She's an advocate of the courts of Lesotho, a specialist in labor law, a seasoned negotiator and policy specialist with over 25 years post-legal qualification. She's very passionate about business development and trade. Her postgraduate studies include courses in the area of labor law, trade and policy, lobbying and advocacy, training, disaster law, and occupational health and safety. She's a fierce defender of tripartism and social dialogue. She sits on numerous boards and committees nationally, regionally, and internationally, representing employers as well. Welcome to this discussion.
I'd like to go straight to Rita Kavashe. Rita, my first question to you, taking on what we've just heard about the laws and have we been agile enough and how are we coping with COVID? My question to you is, as an industry leader, what are some of the COVID-19 impacts on the labor market regulatory framework that you have had to observe and had to grapple with? Welcome, Rita.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here to participate with other leaders on this issue of COVID and how it has impacted labor. Of course, labor has been impacted. As I was preparing for this discussion, I looked at the National Bureau of Statistics data on the issue of employment, and about 1.7 to 1.8 million jobs have been lost in this pandemic, and some industries have been affected more than others, and Mike is going to talk quite a bit around tourism as one of those sectors that have been badly hit, public transportation, education. And it's really interesting that Rose talked to, should then employees be losing jobs just because of a pandemic? And I think that's a fundamental question that I think we'll try to ask as we delve more into this conversation. But as an employer, what of course hit us at the onset of all this pandemic was the fact that the government restricted movement in and out of major cities or major affected areas, and that restriction in itself had an impact on employment regulation. For instance, immediately working hours had to change to comply to curfew, so organizations had to quickly look at working hours and redesign those to reflect the new government regulation that came into place. Then there was a regulation around social distancing, sanitization, and wearing of masks as some of the new topics that were coming to place. And some of the legal and the labor issues that came up with this was that as employers, we had to rethink the definition of workplace. In our manuals and our employment regulations, workplace was the actual physical working area, but because of the situation, we had to quickly redefine workplace to include homes, to respond to the reduction of infection at the workplace by having too many employees being in one location. And there was also need to refocus quite a bit on health and safety, and Rose has talked to that in detail, because health and safety policies and procedures of the company were not to the detail of dealing with such a situation like the pandemic. So we had to quickly go back to our health and safety to incorporate rules around PPE, around hygienic measures, social distancing, washing of hands, and all that. So those were some of the new things that were coming to play. And we also had to develop guidelines that allow for virtual meetings. Board meetings were to be held on the ground where the business is. But because of the situation and the fact that we couldn't all work in one location, that had to change. So we had to write to lawyers. Lawyers had to support us to be able to have these meetings taking place virtually. And issues to do with can employers legally compel employees to take COVID tests? We were faced with that situation that it was not mandatory. How are we to deal with that issue of taking COVID tests? How are we to deal with issues of disclosure? As you're trying to track employees who had contracted COVID, to what level can you disclose this information to another employee, taking into account confidentiality, and privacy on medical information. Traditionally, you don't share that information, but here you are trying to trace employees to see who was affected and needs to go for medical check, actual medical check, should we not. So those were some of the things that were coming to us as employers, and we were battling with the regulation and the legalities of that. How do we deal with stigma? Stigmatization and discrimination related to COVID infection. How then were we to handle that at a workplace? Still an issue, and we had to come up with intervention to deal with that. Then we saw tax incentives, and Rose has talked to that. The pay-as-you-earn deduction, corporate tax refund, just to cushion business, the 8-point stimulus package. Those were great things that came to place to support employers and employees to still continue to navigate and to work under this current situation. And Rose talked about insurance, and that was very, very interesting. During this situation, we were reviewing our insurance policy with the insurance service provider, and we had quite a bit of debate in terms of, is COVID going to be covered? And of course, we had to pay more. And of late, we are reading in the paper that COVID is not going. Some insurance companies are talking about not covering COVID-19. So we had to pay a little bit more, putting more strain as to lift up the premiums to be able to cater for COVID-related issues. Of course, working from home, it has its pluses and